How can oil-rich kingdoms in the Middle East wield so much sway over the US? In May, this question exploded into public view when Qatar gifted the US a luxury Boeing 747 to serve as a potential new Air Force One. The spectacle, a palace in the sky, grabbed global headlines. But as analysts quickly noted, the real story isn't just a free plane. In reality, Gulf petrodollars are reshaping Washington. The likes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE have launched an unparalleled soft power blitz, turning nations of a few million people into some of Washington's most influential foreign players. But how do they do it? And what are the motives behind it? Let's figure it out. Gulf governments spend tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars on American lobbyists and PR outfits. Justice Department records show the UAE alone spent over $150 million on Washington lobbyists since 2016, and Saudi-linked entities similarly pay vast sums. They exploit loopholes in U.S. disclosure law. For example, a 2019 DOJ ruling let Saudi Aramco's U.S. subsidiary lobby without full FARA registration, keeping many contacts hidden from the government and the public. These firms, in turn, hire former U.S. officials and celebrities to burnish the Gulf state's image. For instance, Qatar paid current Attorney General Pam Bondi $115,000 a month to lobby on its behalf. And even FBI Director Kash Patel drew Qatari consultancy fees before joining the agency. A watchdog quipped that ex-U.S. generals, spies, and campaign aides have become agents of influence, pressing Gulf-friendly talking points in Congress and media. But that's just one part of the story. Gulf petrostates also funnel money into Washington think tanks and policy centers to shape debates behind the scenes. A recent analysis found foreign governments gave roughly $110 million to the 50 leading U.S. think tanks over 5 years, with the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi among the biggest donors. This money often arrives as endowments for Middle East programs or sponsorships of conferences. The Atlantic Council and Brookings Institution, for example, each received on the order of $15 to $20 million from Gulf-linked sources since 2019. By funding think tanks on Middle Eastern policy, Gulf donors ensure that scholars and analysts produce papers and commentaries sympathetic to Gulf viewpoints, subtly steering U.S. foreign policy narratives without direct government control. Gulf states are also major funders of American higher education. Qatar alone has poured on the order of $6 billion into U.S. colleges over the past 2 decades, becoming the largest foreign donor to U.S. universities. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have also given heavily. One report finds that Saudi contributions to top universities exceed $2 billion, and the UAE's contributions exceed $1 billion. All such grants encourage universities to soft-pedal criticism of the regimes. Finally, the Gulf wields America's own military-industrial base as leverage. Every year, Gulf rulers buy billions in U.S. arms, jets, missiles, ships, and more, and they use those orders to bind U.S. lawmakers' interests. For example, President Trump's Gulf tour resulted in enormous contracts, roughly $142 billion in new Saudi arms sales, and nearly $2 billion in Qatar purchases were announced. A Reuters tally put U.S. defense deals with Saudi Arabia and Qatar at about $730 billion in total commitments. These sales are traditionally sold to Congress on a jobs narrative. Each F-35 or Apache helicopter is made in America, supporting thousands of factory and engineering jobs. Gulf officials openly boast about the U.S. jobs their businesses create. In essence, the more Washington depends on Gulf orders, the more reluctant lawmakers become to criticize their clients' domestic policies or press for sanctions. Even after an atrocity like Jamal Khashoggi's murder, a light touch prevails. As analysts note, national security ties and arms exports have repeatedly trumped human rights concerns. And this is precisely what the Gulf nations aim for. Moreover, Gulf regimes want the U.S. to fight their battles, especially against Iran, their regional rival. Behind the scenes, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pushed Washington to isolate Tehran. For instance, they lobbied aggressively to label Iran's Revolutionary Guard, or IRGC, a terrorist organization. Such campaigns involved consultants, lobbyists, and even covert influence efforts to flood Capitol Hill with anti-Iran talking points. Gulf actors constantly try to steer U.S. Middle East strategy. Amplifying Iranian threats and equating Iran with terrorism helps justify U.S. hardline policy that aligns with Gulf security interests. Another goal is to shield themselves from scrutiny. Gulf governments have dismal records on free speech, LGBT rights, women's rights, and more. But in Washington, they tend to control the narrative. They sponsor PR campaigns and friendly media coverage to give human rights abusers a friendly face. Indeed, the worst violators worldwide have spent over $168 million since 2010 on U.S. lobbyists and PR firms to polish their reputations. The Gulf monarchies are no exception. Universities and think tanks that take Gulf funds often downplay contentious issues. Even U.S. officials and reporters find it hard to raise Gulf human rights abuses on the record, fearing diplomatic fallout. In effect, Gulf states use their sway to make it costly or taboo in Washington to criticize them. Beyond influence per se, Gulf rulers want guaranteed access to American arms, technology, and markets. They view U.S. sales, from warplanes to surveillance drones, as essential to their security, so they lobby to keep the spigot open. And now, they're moving into next-gen tech. In May, President Trump announced over $200 billion in U.S.-UAE agreements, which included a U.S.-UAE AI acceleration partnership and a new 5-gigawatt AI data center campus, reportedly the largest outside the U.S. These agreements will give the UAE expanded access to advanced American AI chips and know-how. By tying Gulf economies to U.S. tech and industry, the allies ensure that both sides have too much at stake to break ties. In return, Gulf rulers secure long-term delivery of aircraft, weapons, software, and energy contracts. Gulf states also burnish their international profile as indispensable brokers. Qatar, for example, has positioned itself as a go-between in conflicts from Afghanistan to Gaza. It hosted the 2020 U.S. Taliban talks and regularly intermediates between Israel, Hamas, and other parties. In late 2023, Qatari officials helped negotiate a Gaza ceasefire and release of hostages. These peace broker roles serve two aims: projecting an image of global relevance and ensuring Washington treats them as indispensable partners. If Qatar or the UAE did not hold U.S. bases or help shuttle diplomats, it would be harder to sustain such high-level Washington contacts. And of course, there are concrete payoffs as a bonus. Gulf investments in the U.S. economy are real and intended to create constituencies in Congress. The UAE pledged massive projects. For example, a $4 billion aluminum smelter in Oklahoma and a $60 billion oil and gas expansion with ExxonMobil that translate to American jobs. Qatar has touted its purchase of 210 Boeing planes and big energy deals. When the U.S. legislators know a constituency of Gulf-linked investors or workers could be hurt by sanctions or arms embargoes, they're more likely to acquiesce. In effect, the Gulf states often say, "Our money, your interests." But Gulf nations aren't putting all eggs in one basket. They build relationships with everyone, ultimately following whoever protects them, as observers note. Under President Trump, that has paid off. Gulf rulers found a U.S. leader eager for deals, eager to keep security ties strong, and often dismissive of their rights record. Congress remained largely silent as trade deals and base agreements poured in. Yet, this is a pragmatic alliance, not a sentimental one. The Gulf states already have alternatives at hand. China is their biggest trading partner, importing Gulf oil and signing multi-billion-dollar LNG contracts with Qatar. Abu Dhabi's technology firms freely swap Chinese partnerships for Western ones. For example, Universal Acana tech giant G42 dumped Chinese ties in favor of a Microsoft partnership. In other words, Gulf elites are perfectly willing to pivot if Washington shifts gears. They'll shop their petrodollars elsewhere, to Beijing or even Moscow if it safeguards their interests. The long story short, the United States cannot afford to ignore the Gulf Kingdom's deep pockets, whether in Congress, on think tank panels, or behind presidential scenes. Gulf investments create a quiet pressure, demanding U.S. protection of regimes that otherwise flout human rights and stifle dissent. As long as America's interests remain tied to oil, trade, and security in the region, the Gulf will continue buying its place at the table, with or without the U.S. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.